By the mid-1970s, Yuri Andropov was forced to admit that despite all the repressions, the dissident movement was not going away. If anything, it was growing stronger. The chairman of the KGB decided to change his tactics.
The more people they arrested and tried, the more our movement grew. The friends and relatives of those who were jailed were joining our ranks. This was a chain reaction, and Andropov understood that it was a chain reaction. And he decided that it was very dangerous. After trying to fight us with prisons, they tried punitive psychiatry. But they faced organized resistance from us and a lot of pressure from the West. So they had to retreat on that. What could they try next?
In December 1973, The Gulag Archipelago, the seminal book by Alexander Solzhenitsyn that chronicled the mass political repressions in the Soviet Union, was published in Paris. On the 7th of February 1974, Andropov sent a memorandum to Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. "We can no longer postpone a decision on the Solzhenitsyn question," he wrote. "Further delays would cause extremely undesirable consequences for us inside the country." By a special decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, Solzhenitsyn was deprived of his Soviet citizenship. On the 12th of February 1974, he was arrested and placed in the Lefortovo prison. The following day, the writer was put on a plane bound for West Germany.
Andropov considered the experiment with Solzhenitsyn a great success. Within a couple of years after his exile to the West, Solzhenitsyn disappeared from public view. He was looking for seclusion. He was not a politically active person. He was a writer. He wanted to write books. He did not like the media spotlight. So after a couple of years, he disappeared from TV screens, and no one remembered him much. Andropov considered this a great success. He thought that the only way to stop these people from influencing public opinion unfavorably for the Soviet Union was to exile them to the West. Once he decided that the experiment with Solzhenitsyn was a success, he began to repeat it. I was the next.
In December 1976, the Politburo decided to exchange Vladimir Bukovsky, one of the best-known Soviet political prisoners, for the imprisoned Chilean Communist Party leader, Luis Kovalan.
It was a gray and gloomy morning. The wake-up call sounded. As we got up, the prison warden knocked on the door of our cell and said, "Everyone collect your belongings and get ready." Where did they want to take us? Maybe it was to another cell, maybe to another building. It was important to know. Every little detail is important in prison. And then I remembered that the day before, I had taken my boots for repair, so I called the warden and said, "Give me back my boots. They're in repair. I need them." "I will get them," he said. Some time passed, but no one brought my boots. I called the warden again. "Give me back my boots, Governor. I won't go anywhere without them." Then they took me to the guard post. There was a captain on duty there whom I knew. So I said to him, "Give me back my boots, Governor." And he looked at me with sort of a pity in his eyes and said, "You won't need your boots anymore." And my heart sank, because there is only one reason not to need boots. We drove for a long time. I couldn't understand anything. I ran out of guesses. All the possibilities I had come up with in my mind did not come to pass. Finally, we arrived somewhere and the car stopped. I heard doors closing and opening, and the senior officer came out from his car, and suddenly I heard the sound of aircraft engines. Oh, so we're at an airport. As we crossed the Soviet border in the air, Baranov, or whatever his real name was, came up to me and said, "Now, as we are crossing the Soviet border, I must officially tell you that you're being expelled from the territory of the USSR." I asked, "Is that all?" He said, "That's all." I asked, "What about my citizenship?" He said, "You have not been deprived of your citizenship. You will be given a Soviet passport valid for 5 years. "This is interesting," I said. "What about my prison sentence? I still have half of it left." "Your sentence has not been overturned," he said. "It remains in force." "So what's happening here from the legal standpoint?" I continued. You're kidnapping me. You're helping me to escape from prison. If I'm still a prisoner, why are you taking me to Zurich? This is the decision of the government. I cannot say anything more, he said. The exchange itself was conducted with the help of the ambassadors. There were 3 embassy cars on the Zurich airport runway. The U.S. ambassador's car, the Chilean ambassador's car, and the Soviet ambassador's car. The Soviet ambassador took me and my family into his car. The American ambassador took Korvalon into his car and drove him to the Soviet plane. Then he drove to our car, took us and drove us to the airport. That was the whole exchange.
The Soviet government found this method of getting rid of political opponents to be the most effective option. By the mid-1980s, many active dissenters had been expelled from the Soviet Union.
About 10 high-ranking KGB officers barged into my prison cell and told me to get my belongings and go with them. It was not clear where. And then they read out the decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet that so-and-so has been deprived of his Soviet citizenship for malicious anti-Soviet activities and must leave the Soviet Union within 2 hours. Of course, I asked them, can I leave earlier? And the plane took off. It was a long flight, and I could see by the sun that we were flying in a westward direction. Well, the Soviet Union's borders end somewhere, so I demanded to know where we were. There were just 4 KGB officers and I in an entire plane that could accommodate 100 people. Finally, one of the KGB officers told me in a solemn voice that because of my bad behavior, I had been deprived of my Soviet citizenship by a special decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, and that I was being deported from the Soviet Union. I told them that I, too, wanted to make a statement. No, he answered. We've had enough of your statements. I was walking on Nikitsky Boulevard on my way to a rally when 5 huge men surrounded me and told me to follow them. I asked who they were, and they told me they were KGB officers. Then they said, if you think that when we arrest you again, you will be sent to another resort like the last time, they meant internal exile. You are wrong. You will be sent to a prison camp for a very long time. We are not joking with you, they continued. We know that you have an invitation to go to Israel. It would be better for you if you went there. One day they grabbed me on the street, put me inside their car, and drove me to Malaya Lubyanka, to the FSB. To the KGB, a Freudian slip. Someone who called himself General Belov, he could have been Belov, Chernov, or Ivanov, presented me with an ultimatum. I must leave the Soviet Union within 20 days. They would pay all my expenses, my plane ticket, my Israeli visa. But if I didn't leave the country, both my brother and I would be arrested. I refused. I was 24 at the time. I had a lot of strength. I didn't go anywhere. My brother was arrested in December 1977, shortly before New Year's Day. I was arrested in May 1978 and tried that same summer. 2 men in plain clothes read me the decision of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet to deprive me of my Soviet citizenship and to expel me from the USSR. It was signed by Gorbachev, and they told me this: when you arrive in the West, you will want to immediately resume your anti-Soviet propaganda. Don't do it. Remember, much of what you have been talking about will be implemented. When Gorbachev came to power, it was unclear what he would do. At the beginning, he did not behave like a liberal. Anatoly Marchenko, a political prisoner, died under Gorbachev. But his death affected Gorbachev, and he invited Sakharov to return from internal exile. Before that, it was the explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear plant. The government tried to keep the explosion secret, but was unable to do so. Then Gorbachev said, "Now we will have glasnost, openness." And so it began.
All these attempts at economic acceleration, the anti-alcohol campaign, and the military adventure in Afghanistan took the Soviet Union to a crisis point. I think that the reforms were forced on Gorbachev, both by political and by economic circumstances.
The architects of perestroika did not want to introduce a just and bountiful democracy. The architects of perestroika wanted to preserve the power of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and reform the party a little in order to help it meet the challenges of the time. The death of Anatoly Marchenko, a member of the Moscow-Helsinki group, had a huge effect. Marchenko went on a hunger strike, demanding the release of political prisoners, and died. The Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe held a special session in Vienna, and Marchenko's death dealt the final blow to the Soviet delegation. International public opinion played a very important role. Even though Soviet leaders had no conscience, no honor, no understanding of the concepts of decency and dignity, they still wanted to be respected by Western leaders. Every criminal wants to be respected and not be considered the worst of all scoundrels, at least not the worst one. And this is why Soviet leaders paid attention to the West. And when Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire, that was the last straw. They began to realize that they really were viewed by the outside world as scoundrels.
The return of Andrei Sakharov from internal exile in the city of Gorky, where he was sent along with his wife, Elena Bonner, in January 1980, was the first symbolic step heralding the approaching end of the Soviet regime. Sakharov's exile lasted for 7 long years and was ended with a telephone call from Moscow in December 1986.
All those years, we had no telephone in our apartment. More than that, these scoundrels would turn off all the payphones near our apartment building. If, God forbid, we needed an ambulance, we couldn't even call it. At around 10 p.m. the day before, we heard a doorbell. There were 3 men standing on our doorstep, 1 handyman and 2 men who were obviously from the KGB. One of the KGB agents told us that they had come to install a phone line. We were very surprised. For 6 years and 11 months, they had refused to install a phone line in our apartment, and suddenly they had come to do it. When they installed the line, they told us that we would receive a phone call the following day. The following day came. Andrei said, "This is nonsense," and started to leave to go to the bakery. As he began putting on his coat, the phone rang. I picked up the phone, and the voice at the other end said, "Gorbachev will be speaking to you." There was a police post outside our apartment door, and there was always a ruckus there. Women, drunk men, constant entertainment. They were always very loud. I looked out the door and said, "Be quiet. Gorbachev is on the phone." They all went quiet, and even ran away, I think, except for the police officer on duty. The conversation between Gorbachev and Sakharov was brief, only a few minutes. Gorbachev told him, "We have consulted among ourselves and made a decision. Return to your patriotic activities."
Andrei Sakharov invented the Soviet hydrogen bomb. But that did not change the situation in the world. And then he began to use another weapon, the weapon of free speech. And that internal freedom of a small group of people blew up the Soviet system from the inside. I think this is a very optimistic lesson for the world about the strength of freedom. I would not be honest if I said that we expected the Soviet regime to collapse. We couldn't even imagine that we would live to see the time when there would not be idiotic red posters hanging in the streets, and when there would not be another general secretary mumbling from the podium. We did not believe it could happen. It was a distant dream. But nevertheless, the system did collapse. The human rights idea was widely accepted and proved to be long-lasting, and it surfaced again in 1990 and 1991, when the coal miners went on strike. Their demand was not for bread or for pay raises. Their demand was for the abolition of Article 6 of the Soviet Constitution that provided for one-party rule. When you start loosening the reins, the horses inevitably start to feel free. It's difficult for them not to. And so the situation got out of control.
In the late 1980s and the early 1990s, it was no longer small groups of dissenters, but hundreds of thousands of people who took to the streets of Russian cities to demand democracy and freedom. The whole country was engulfed in anti-communist demonstrations. The protests were led by Russia's new president, Boris Yeltsin, who had defiantly resigned from the Communist Party. The grand finale came in August 1991, when the attempt by communist and KGB leaders to reverse the movement towards democracy was met with mass civic resistance. 3 days, the 19th to the 21st of August 1991, ended 74 years of Soviet rule.
When people realize that history was in their hands and went into the streets, when society felt its own strength, that was simply amazing. I felt pride that our people finally went into the streets, that they shook off that slavery and were ready to die there at the Moscow White House. That was exactly what needed to be done. For the first time, I felt a certain pride in our poor society.
On the 25th of December 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev, the last General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, left the Kremlin. That same evening, on the order of Russian President Boris Yeltsin, the Soviet red flag was forever lowered from the Kremlin's flagstaff.
I remember that ceremony, when the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin, and when the Soviet national anthem was played for the last time. Well, we didn't know then that that anthem would come back. And at that moment, I remembered that when I was in prison, we were woken up at 6 o'clock every morning by the Soviet national anthem that was played on the radio. That powerful anthem would break into the cell, weigh down on you, and hunt you down. It would not let you sleep. There was no escape from it. It was the triumph of the boorish Soviet system. And here I was, listening to that anthem for the very last time. Now it sounded like a funeral march for the Soviet system. It was sweet music for my ears. I thought about the KGB leaders who had warned me that I would never come out of prison alive, that human rights defenders in the Soviet Union would never come out of prison alive. And now it was the Soviet Union that had collapsed. Its anthem had become a funeral march. Communism was disappearing. There was no reaction in the West. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was greeted here with total indifference. I was really angered by this. This was a great event. The Soviet Union, which had existed for 70-something years, had come to an end. And so, to commemorate that event, I planted this tree. This tree was planted in December 1991. It's a decorative cherry tree. It does not bear fruit, but it blossoms beautifully.